Hi folks, hope you're okay today. We're just going to look for 20-30 minutes at a book by Michael J. Kruger, and we're going to just think about the canon of scripture, formation of canon, and then we'll also listen to a bit of his lecture, and we'll just talk about it just for a few minutes. I'll talk about it. So it's going to be about 30 minutes. What I want to do in this Google Hangout is just to encourage you to go and read his book, get hold of his book, read it, and go and listen to his lectures. And I think they'll be a help to you. You can get them on Reformed Theological Seminary iTunes. And so without further ado, let's just get into some of his book. We'll go to... you can get about 50 pages of his book free on PDF if you type in www.wtsbooks.com common PDF links 9781433505003 PDF. But if you type in the title of the book and his name, PDF, it should come up. So he writes, I think we'll just read his introduction. Ernest Best, no one has come up with satisfactory solution to how we determine which books should be in the canon. He writes, this book is about a very specific problem confronting the Christian faith. It's certainly not a new problem, though there are plenty of those, but it is perhaps one of the oldest. For the infant church, it was one of its earliest and most potent challenges. It continues to be a serious point of contention even during the time of the Reformation. And still today, it endures as some of perennial questions faced by any believer in our modern and postmodern age. It was what D.F. Strauss has called the Achilles heel of Protestant Christianity. It was what many still consider to be, as Herman Ridderbus has observed, the hidden dragging illness of the church. It is the problem of the canon. The problem of canon, at least as we are using the phrase here, refers to the fundamental question of how we as Christians can know that we have the right 27 books in our New Testament. Why not 26 books or 28? Of course, such a question would not be asked if the New Testament were like most other books formed, more or less all at the same time in the same place by a single author. Instead, within the boundaries of the New Testament, we are faced with a rather complex array of different books, authors, geographical settings, theological perspectives, historical context, that are all brought together into one unified volume. What do all these books share in common? What was the process by which they were brought together? And why should the results of that process be considered normative for the modern church? Moreover, what are we to make of disputes within the early church over some of these books? What of the abundance of apocryphal literature that has been discovered? And what should we do if we discovered, say, a lost epistle of Paul? When faced with this plethora of questions, we are tempted to agree with Ernest Best when he declared, no matter where we look, there are problems, and it may therefore be simpler at this stage to cut our losses and simply dispense with the concept of canon. Despite these problems, many questions deserve and require an answer from biblical Christianity. For if Christians cannot adequately answer these questions about the canonical boundaries of the New Testament, then on what grounds could they ever appeal to the content of New Testament? Certainly there can be no New Testament theology if there is no such thing as a New Testament in the first place. Thus, questions about canon can take on more foundational significance than other types of questions. It is one thing for a person to question the meaning of a given passage, whether it says what we think it says, or to question whether a particular passage is historically or factually accurate, but it's quite another to question whether that passage belongs in the Bible. Critics of biblical Christianity have long recognized the significance of the canon question and have therefore focused much of their scholarly energies on that very issue. Although it has been more than 2 centuries since Johann Semler offered one of the earliest attacks on the origin of the New Testament canon, i.e. treatise on the free investigation of the canon, 1771-1775, the question is still hotly contested in the modern day. Kurt Aland, is a well-known work, The Problem of the New Testament Canon, declared that the question of canon will make its way to the center of theological and ecclesiastical debate. Because, quote, the question is one which confronts not only the New Testament scholar, but every Christian theologian, end of quote. Indeed, Allen has been proved right as modern scholars have continued to press their critique of the biblical canon, offering new challenges and proposals and keeping the canon question at the center of much of modern biblical scholarship. William Markson argued that the church made mistakes when it originally chose the canon and therefore it is subject to revision. And when it comes to Hebrews and 2 Peter, we would remove both writings from the canon. Quote, David Dungan has suggested that advances in biblical scholarship will precipitate a massive series of changes regarding the shape and content of the Bible, which should rival for creativity the Reformation period, if not the 2nd through the 5th centuries. Robert Funk agrees that the developments in modern scholarship have opened the door to a consideration of what ancient documents and Christian scriptures ought to contain, and he adds it will be a great tragedy if we do not seize the opportunity to revamp and revise. Bart Ehrman joins his voice to this chorus of modern criticisms of the canon and declares it to be an invention of the dominant Christian factions of early Christianity, designed to suppress or oppress the other fractions of the church, which different theological convictions. So those are some of the reasons why we need to think about the canon, because there is a movement within scholarship that is trying to loosen the idea of canon, trying to say that there are different canons, and this will filter into the church. This will filter into the Christian church over time. And so we need to, and also when you're on the streets doing street preaching or evangelism, when you're doing apologetics on the internet, if you've got a good grounding on why we have the canon and the history of the canon and all the rest of it, you've got a good basis of defending Christianity from a textual basis. I'm going to put a few video clips of Michael Kruger. You'll just hear his voice. And then I'll put this is Dr. Michael Kruger on how did the canon develop.
Often claims in regards to the New Testament canon that early Christians had a variety of New Testament canons at their disposal. He often talks about what he calls wild diversity within early Christianity, that in the early centuries of the church, people were reading all sorts of books. There was all sorts of different types of versions of Christianity with their own gospels and their own documents. And so it gives this impression that we have this sort of competing set of books where the New Testament canon was in some sense a literary free-for-all, where no one knew which were the right books and no one knew which were the wrong books, and everyone was kind of doing their own thing. Now, that type of presentation certainly has a lot of rhetorical advantages. It can certainly sound overwhelming to any student that's not aware of the issues in early Christianity. The problem is that it's entirely misleading in the way it describes the way the canon developed. If one wants to portray the New Testament canon as developing in a way that was entirely haphazard and open-ended until the 4th century, that's simply not the case. When we look into the early centuries of the church, particularly the 2nd century, we realize that the core of the New Testament canon was in place almost from the very beginning. What do we mean by core? What we mean is the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and at least 10, if not 13 epistles of Paul. For example, one of our earliest canonical lists, the Muratorian Fragment, dates from the late 2nd century, probably around 170 or 180 AD. In that particular document, it is clear that there's only 4 Gospels that are received, and it lists all of 13 of Paul's epistles. Now that's in the middle of the 2nd century. Now what that tells you then is that the Muratorian Fragment, that canonical list, didn't make up those things. It's obviously picking up earlier tradition. What we see then is that there's a core of New Testament books that were never really in dispute at all. There was never really a dispute about the Gospels in any fundamental way. It was these 4 from the very start. When it came to Paul's epistles, the core were in place from the very beginning. When we talk about any disputes at all, if we can even use that term, it really has to do with just a handful of books. Some of the peripheral books, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, and 2nd Peter are the primary books that discussions center upon. But to portray the New Testament canon as entirely open-ended is entirely misleading because the core was there from the start. And if the core was there from the start, then decisions were already made about the divinity of Jesus. Decisions were already made about who he was and what he came to do. Decisions were already made about the nature of the gospel message. So this, irregardless of what was decided about 2nd Peter or Jude, the trajectory of Christianity was already determined from a very early time, much earlier than most people realize.
Amen. That video is How Did the New Testament Canon Develop? Project by Dr. Kruger. Now we're just going to listen to Dr. Kruger give a lecture, and we'll listen to it for a few minutes.
The question is this: why was there a New Testament at all in early Christianity? Or put differently, why did the New Testament even come into existence in the first place? Now, we don't ask that question much in evangelical circles. After all, for us, the New Testament's existence is a bit of a given. We are more concerned perhaps with how it developed and when it was finalized and whether we have the right books. But this is not true in modern scholarship. Modern scholars have begun to ask this very question of why do we have a New Testament canon at all? And the answer, they argue, is not to be found in the first century, they say. There was nothing about earliest Christianity or the books themselves, we are told, that would naturally lead to the development of a canon. Instead, the answer is to be found in the later church. The canon was an ecclesiastical product, say modern scholars, that was designed to meet ecclesiastical needs. Now, sure, the books themselves were produced at a much earlier point, but the whole idea of canon was something that's retroactively imposed upon books at a later time. Books are not written as canon, they say, they become canon. What you see here then is an interesting development in the way canon is conceived of in early Christianity. Canon in the minds of scholars today is not something that originated at all in the first century. It's an idea that came up late and then was imposed on books written for an entire other purpose. Harry Gamble comments on this. He says this, and by the way, this is a stunning quote. Listen to what he says. There is no intimation at all that the early church entertained the idea of Christian scriptures. Therefore, the New Testament, as we think of it, was utterly remote from the minds of the first generation of Christian believers. In other words, in the mind of many scholars today, the Christian canon is, well, not Christian. It's not something Christians would have done in the earliest phase. It's not something that was even on their mind. They were concerned with oral proclamation. The idea of writing things down in authoritative books was completely foreign to the development of early Christianity. Now it is here, then, that we come to